It was an ordinary day at the bustling airport. The hum of travelers, the soft murmur of flight announcements, and the scent of coffee filling the air. But no one noticed Harold Cooper, a quiet elderly man, as he walked toward his seat. That is, until security stormed over. "Sir, we need to remove you," the guard said coldly. The passengers gawked, whispers of disbelief swirling. Little did they know Harold was not just a frail old man. He was about to change everything. One call and the airline would be shaken to its core. Before we start, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. Now let's begin. It was an ordinary day at JFK Airport. The bustling sounds of travelers, the steady hum of rolling suitcases, and the low murmur of flight attendants giving their last announcements. The sky was overcast, a gray blanket hanging over the city as passengers made their way toward their gates. Among the crowd was a man who looked out of place, a quiet elderly man with the weathered face of someone who had lived through countless storms. His name was Harold Cooper, and he was headed to Los Angeles. But what no one could see in that moment was that Harold was not just any passenger. The young flight attendant, Sarah, glanced at Harold as he made his way to his seat in first class. Her eyes flicked over him quickly, taking in the creased brown coat, the slightly bent posture, and the scuffed leather briefcase he carried. She frowned. "That seat is reserved," she muttered to herself. But Harold, with his calm and steady pace, did not notice. He made his way down the aisle, his shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. He was determined, every step calculated, his eyes fixed forward as if he had no doubt in the world. Moments later, whispers began to ripple through the passengers seated in first class. A few people stared at Harold as he settled into the plush seat. One of them, a businessman in a designer suit, raised an eyebrow, looking down his nose at Harold. "He must have bought a seat as a joke," he whispered to the woman beside him, both of them snickering under their breath. Harold sat unfazed, his eyes closed as he let out a small sigh of relief. The flight was about to begin, but the whispers did not die down. Sarah, the flight attendant, returned, now speaking in hushed tones to a uniformed security guard standing near the gate. "That man in seat 1A, he should not be there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The guard frowned and began to move toward the front of the cabin, his boots sounding like a warning as he walked past rows of seats. Harold had barely opened his eyes when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He looked up to see the guard standing there, his expression serious. "Sir, I am afraid you are in the wrong seat," the guard said, his tone cold and impersonal. Harold blinked slowly, surprised by the interruption. "This is my seat," he replied calmly, holding up his boarding pass. The guard glanced at the pass, then back at Harold. "Please follow me," he said sharply. Confused, Harold stood up, his joints creaking from years of age. The passengers around him watched in silence, some exchanging glances, others looking down at their phones, unaware of what was about to unfold. Harold followed the guard down the aisle, his face calm but his mind racing. Why had this happened? He had done nothing wrong. As they reached the door, the guard turned to him again. "Sir, we have to ask you to leave the aircraft." The words hit Harold like a punch. "Leave?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'm in my seat." The guard was unmoved. "Please, sir, we are following protocol." And just like that, Harold was escorted off the plane. The murmurs of the passengers grew louder as the door closed behind him. The cold, unforgiving steel of the airport gate seemed to mock him. His heart raced, but he stood tall, his face betraying nothing. No one understood who he was. No one understood the power he held in his hands. Outside, standing on the tarmac, Harold took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. He had one call to make, just one. The moment his fingers dialed the number, everything was about to change. What no one knew was that Harold Cooper was not just an elderly man who had been unjustly thrown off a plane. He was the man who would bring this airline to its knees. With a single phone call, he would take everything from them, and the story of his quiet revenge would shake the airline world to its core. But no one, not even Harold, could have predicted how this would all unfold. Harold's fingers trembled as he dialed the number. The connection hummed for a moment, and then the voice on the other end came through clear, calm, and confident. Mr. Cooper, how can I help you today? It was Robert Gray, the CEO of one of the largest investment firms in the world, Harold's firm, the one Harold owned. For a brief second, the world seemed to freeze. Harold inhaled deeply, gathering his thoughts. The chaos at the airport, the laughter, the whispers, the coldness of being humiliated, seemed so distant now, as if it had never even happened. His voice was steady when he spoke. Robert, I need you to do something for me. Something big, Harold said, his words calm but carrying an authority that could not be ignored. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Robert's voice grew more attentive. Anything you need, Mr. Cooper. What is it? Harold closed his eyes for a moment. The guard's face, the sneering look of the man who had forced him off the plane, was burned into his memory. The humiliation had been unbearable, but now Harold's mind was sharper than ever. He had seen so many moments like this before in his life. People underestimating him, people thinking they could push him around, but they did not know who they were dealing with. Pull all of our funding from that airline, Harold said, his voice even. $4 billion, every last cent. There was another pause, but this time it was filled with disbelief. Mr. Cooper, are you sure? That is an enormous sum. Do you really want to? I said pull it. Now. Robert did not hesitate. Understood, sir. I will handle it immediately. Harold could almost hear the wheels turning in Robert's head, his mind racing as he processed the magnitude of the request. But it was already done. The call was over, the decision made, and the chain of events had been set in motion. Harold stood still for a moment, letting the weight of his actions settle in. He had been thrown off the plane. He had been humiliated. But in that moment, Harold Cooper knew something that no one else could possibly understand. The airline had just made a catastrophic mistake, one that would cost them everything. As the sound of the tarmac echoed in his ears, Harold walked away from the airport gate. His steps were slow, deliberate. He could feel the eyes of others on him, but he did not care. He had made his call. Now the real work was about to begin. Back at the airline's headquarters, the chaos was already starting. Robert had acted swiftly, calling in the entire finance team, instructing them to pull every penny of funding from the airline. The pressure was immense, but Robert was not one to shy away from a challenge. As the news spread through the company, the executives scrambled to understand why they were losing billions in real time. Panic began to set in, but it was too late to reverse anything. Harold had already won. It would not be long before the world would find out. The CEO who had laughed at an elderly man, the security guard who had been so quick to humiliate him, would all soon realize the grave mistake they had made. The airline, once one of the giants of the industry, was now on the brink of financial ruin, and Harold Cooper had orchestrated it all with one phone call. As he left the airport, Harold's mind was already moving to the next step. This was just the beginning. The airline would soon learn that the price of arrogance was far greater than they could ever imagine. As Harold made his way to his car, the cold evening air biting at his skin, he felt a strange sense of calm. There was no rush, no need to hurry. The damage was already done. The $4 billion that had been swiftly pulled from the airline would send shockwaves through their entire operation. But Harold's plan was far from complete. This was just the first step in a much larger game. He knew that once the news broke, it would only be a matter of time before the world's media descended on the airline. They would demand answers. The executives would be scrambling, desperately trying to put out the flames of financial ruin that Harold had set ablaze. But it was not just the airline he wanted to hurt. It was the arrogance that ran through its veins, the belief that they could treat people like nothing more than pawns in their game. Harold had been a pawn once. He remembered the days when he had struggled to make ends meet, when he had been dismissed by the very people who now thought they could crush him. They had underestimated him then, just as they had done today, and now he was going to make them pay for it. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Robert. The funds have been pulled. The media is already asking questions. I have informed the board, and they are in an emergency meeting right now. Harold smiled to himself. It was happening faster than he had anticipated. The tension was building, the pressure mounting. The airline's leadership would have no idea how to recover from this. They would be scrambling, pointing fingers at one another, wondering who was responsible for such a catastrophic failure. And through it all, Harold would remain in the shadows, watching as they tore themselves apart. But Harold had something else planned, a final, devastating move that would leave them with nothing. He needed to make sure that no one ever forgot the lesson that had been taught here. It was not just about money, it was about respect, it was about power. As Harold turned onto the main highway, his thoughts shifted to the airline's CEO, the man who had ordered his removal from the plane, the man who had laughed, thinking that Harold was just another passenger, just another face in the crowd, the man who had no idea who he had just crossed. Harold had done his homework. He knew everything about the CEO, his family, his investments, his weaknesses, and Harold had a plan to exploit them all. He would be the one to decide when the CEO's empire would crumble. The airline's downfall would be nothing compared to the destruction Harold would unleash upon him personally. The CEO had made one fatal mistake that day. He had treated Harold Cooper as if he were disposable. And now Harold was going to make sure that the world knew exactly who he was. He was going to change everything, not just for the airline, but for every person who had ever been overlooked, disrespected, or humiliated. As Harold reached his home, he paused for a moment, staring at the front door. There was no turning back now. The game was on. The pieces were in motion. And soon the world would see the full extent of what Harold Cooper was capable of. As the morning sun slowly rose, casting a faint glow over the city, Harold sat in his study, staring at the phone in his hand. It felt as if the world had shifted overnight. The call he had made, the one that would change everything, had already begun to reverberate across the industry. The airline's stock had plummeted. Rumors spread like wildfire, and now it was only a matter of time before the world discovered just who was behind the storm. The phone buzzed once again, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a call from Robert. He answered quickly, his heart beating a little faster than usual. "Harold!" Robert's voice crackled on the other end. "The media is all over this. They are asking questions. The CEO is in full damage control mode. They are scrambling, but this is bad. They have no idea what hit them." Harold smiled, his fingers lightly tapping the desk. "Good," he replied calmly. "Let them panic. Let them feel the weight of their mistake." Robert paused for a moment, the silence heavy. "Harold, you understand what you've done, right? This is bigger than just money now. You've got the whole industry watching. They will retaliate. You have to be ready." "I have been ready for years, Robert. This was never about the money." Harold's voice was steady, unwavering. "This is about something far greater than that. It is about sending a message." The line went quiet again, the weight of Harold's words settling in. Robert knew what Harold meant. It was never just about financial gain. It was about dismantling the system, showing the world that power did not belong solely in the hands of the wealthy and the untouchable. Harold had been humiliated once, but now he was the one pulling the strings. "You have a plan, don't you?" Robert asked, his voice tinged with both awe and concern. "I do," Harold replied, "and it is about to unfold. The airline's CEO, he is the target, but this will go deeper. I want him to feel the weight of every person who has ever been dismissed, disrespected, or crushed by people like him. The world will know that they are not untouchable." Just as Harold finished speaking, his phone buzzed again. He glanced down to see an alert from a news outlet. "Breaking news. Airline CEO faces criticism as $4 billion investment withdrawn." Harold's plan was working. The first wave of public scrutiny had begun, and it was only going to get worse from here. But this was just the beginning. He was not just going to let the CEO sweat it out. Harold's mind was already calculating his next move. A corporate titan like him had enemies, and Harold knew exactly how to exploit those connections. He had learned long ago that power was not about having money. It was about understanding who held the strings and how to pull them. "I need to make a call," Harold said to Robert, his tone suddenly businesslike. "Get me everything on the CEO's personal life, every weakness, every secret. I want to know everything." Robert hesitated, but only for a second. "You'll have it. I'll send it over as soon as I can." Harold hung up, his mind already racing with possibilities. The media frenzy was just a small taste of what was to come. Now that the airline's leadership was on the ropes, it was time to make the final move. Harold would make sure the CEO would never forget the day he had made the mistake of crossing Harold Cooper. As the day progressed, Harold began setting his plan into motion. He was patient, meticulous. Every piece was falling into place, and once it was complete, there would be no turning back. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, Harold stood by the window of his penthouse, staring out over the sprawling city below. The lights of the city blinked like stars, but his mind was focused elsewhere. His plan was coming to fruition, and there was no turning back. Every move he had made had been calculated, every person he had spoken to carefully selected. He had already reshaped the world in his image, but now with the final piece of the puzzle falling into place, he was about to take everything to its ultimate conclusion. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Robert. They have gone into full panic mode. The CEO is reportedly being questioned by law enforcement. Media outlets are demanding answers. It is only a matter of time before they realize what they have lost. Harold smiled, his fingers curling around the edge of his glass of scotch. The sound of ice clinking in the glass was the only thing that broke the silence. Good, he whispered. Let them panic. Let them feel the consequences of their actions. But Harold knew it was not enough to just destroy the airline's reputation. He had to make the CEO pay. He had to make him feel the sting of every person who had ever been mistreated by the elite. Harold's plan had never been about a simple financial settlement. It had been about sending a message to the entire industry, to the people who thought they could play God with the lives of others, to the ones who thought their wealth and influence would protect them from the consequences of their arrogance. A sudden knock at the door pulled Harold from his thoughts. He set his drink down and moved toward the door. As he opened it, he was greeted by a young man, sharply dressed in a tailored suit. The man stepped inside, handing Harold a sealed envelope. "Everything is ready, Mr. Cooper," the man said with a nod. "It is all in place." Harold took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hands. This was it, the final step. He opened it carefully, scanning the contents. Inside was a legal document, one that would change everything. It was a demand for the full $4 billion investment to be returned, plus interest within 48 hours. If not, the document threatened to expose the CEO's darkest secrets, secrets that would completely destroy his career and his life. Harold had what he needed. Now it was time to make the call that would end it all. He dialed the number, his hands steady despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. "Mr. Cooper," the voice on the other end of the line answered, trembling slightly. I did not expect to hear from you so soon." "I have what I need," Harold said calmly, his voice cool and collected. "But if you want to avoid the fallout, you will comply with my demands. I suggest you start thinking about the damage control. You have 48 hours. Do not make me wait any longer." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the tension palpable. Then the CEO spoke again, his voice shaky. "You do not know who you are dealing with, Harold. You have made a grave mistake." Harold's lips curled into a smile. "I know exactly who I am dealing with, and you are about to find out just how wrong you were to cross me." The line went dead. Harold placed the phone back down, his eyes glinting with a cold satisfaction. The CEO had no idea what was coming next. Harold had played his cards perfectly, and now the final act was unfolding. As he sat back in his chair, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The world would soon know what it meant to underestimate Harold Cooper. It was no longer about money or power, it was about legacy. Harold was about to make sure that his would be the last name anyone ever remembered.